Welcome here on the Manage Agile conference.
Thank you.
Well, my very first question would be, we talk about management in an agile environment. How would you characterize the word agile management, or what is agile management?
So in Scrum, there's two major traditional activities that managers used to do before Scrum, and there's a change when you move to Scrum. And to boil it down, I talk about what and how. And in traditional management, questions of what is going to be done for the product, what are the requirements, customer elicitation, and all of that kind of stuff was often involving managers, R&D managers. And on the other hand, how it's going to be done involved managers directing workers, figuring out tasks, coordinating between workers, and so forth. And that consumed the majority of traditional management activity. And in Scrum, what is shifted to the product owner, for example, the head of product management or a business side user. So everything related to the responsibility of what is no longer the responsibility of the traditional manager role. And similarly, the question of how is primarily shifted to the team and a little bit to the product owner who's from the business side. And so all of the how responsibilities are eliminated from the traditional manager role as well. So this largely removes most of the traditional responsibilities of managers, what and how. And as you might know, there's a trend around the world now to also eliminate the relatively unskillful practices of traditional performance appraisal and review also, which is another time consumer of traditional management. And so when you take away what, how, and traditional management overhead practices like performance review, it leaves very little left for the traditional manager role. And so one of the things that you see in scaling Scrum is it simplifies the organization so much that there's very little need for traditional managers. And that then begs the question, what can they do? Well, one of the things that they can do is focus on improving the value delivery capability of the system. So you have the teams, you have the product owner, and what you want them to do is to deliver value with low cycle time and without impediments. And one of the ways that managers can help out is asking the question, what can we do to improve the system for the flow of value? For example, when impediments are communicated from the teams about the organizational design, for example, traditional career paths like single job titles and traditional career paths up those job titles, that's a kind of an organizational design element that the remaining managers can work to remove. Or more broadly, you can just look at all of the organizational design elements, single function teams, component teams, traditional project and program managers. All of this complexity is eliminated in Scrum, and the remaining managers can do work to try to eliminate those elements to make it simple for the teams to deliver value.
Well, when you say the remaining managers, that obviously you just explained the very dramatic shift in their responsibilities and their duties, whatever you call it. But you talk already also about the remaining ones.
Right.
That means that you do see a dramatic change on the pure number base.
Yeah.
How many managers and management levels we have in an organization when we talk about agile management? Is it always a very flat management hierarchy?
Well, for example, I focus on large-scale Scrum, and in large-scale Scrum, you can actually run the system with virtually no managers. All that you need is one product owner from the business side and the self-organizing teams. So when you move to large-scale Scrum, without a doubt, there's a dramatic simplification of the organizational design in terms of roles, positions, and so forth. And insofar as some managers remain, for example, some might remain because traditional organizations often require a hierarchy where people report to a line manager. As you probably know, there's no longer a need for program managers or project managers because there's no longer any functional teams or component teams. You don't need any of those manager roles. So you don't need functional managers, you don't need component team managers, you don't need project managers, you don't need program managers. And about all that might be left is that in some traditional organizations there's a desire or an organizational constraint for line managers. And if that's necessary, and if there's no longer the activity of traditional HR practices like performance reviews and appraisals and so forth, the small number of line managers need a way to help out, and trying to improve the value delivery of the capability of the system by eliminating the traditional organizational design elements is one of the ways that they can help.
But I think that's a very good
Transition?
Yeah.
Yeah.
To the next question. That sounds that the organization has to change quite a bit if you go to an agile management kind of approach. If you look at your experience regarding supporting such agile transitions, well, that sounds like it's not a very quick thing, because usually the decisions in the companies nowadays is done by managers, and if you want to get rid of managers, there must be a very good way of making them accept this fact. So I think the transition of getting rid of people, which have to decide about being obsolete or whatever, might be quite complicated.
Right.
So what is your experience in terms of how does it work? How long does it take?
My observation is that it goes on one of two paths. So when I introduce less or large-scale Scrum in an organization, it's never done by pushing or selling. The organization has to actually want to do it. And if they don't want to change the organizational design, then there's no point in really starting. Because if you try to introduce less or agile or large-scale Scrum, which implies a very simple organizational design without much need for managers, but the traditional manager roles remain, then you have a fundamental contradiction in the new organizational design, and it essentially just becomes fake. So what we recommend is either that a real organizational design is changed to the simplified model of Scrum, which has very little need for managers, or it's best not to start, because then it turns into a fake adoption with all kinds of conflict and complications. Now, in the case that a real adoption is going to be of interest to the organization, how I recommend doing it is that there's a discussion with the senior management of a product group. They come to understand the organizational design implications, which is the end of project program managers, the end of functional manager roles, the end of component manager roles. And if they're not interested in doing that, then of course that's fine. But if they are interested in doing that, then there's an important principle, which is job safety and salary safety, but not role safety, because we're talking about a significant organizational design change. And we need to find new roles for those good people, which could be in other parts of the organization and still traditional groups, or moving into, for example, hands-on developer roles or something like that. Now, your original question was how long it takes. Well, to actually have the conversation and do the learning with the senior leadership team about the implications of simplifying the organization really only takes about 2 or 3 days. It doesn't take a whole lot of education. And then the senior management needs to decide whether they want to change the organizational design or not. The decision doesn't take long. It could just take a couple of days. And then from that point, we know the target state, which is a very simplified organizational design with just self-managing teams and a product owner from business and very little else. And then how long does it take to flip the organization to that system? Doesn't necessarily take long. It could just take a couple of weeks of preparation of deciding to do it, of finding new roles for the traditional managers in other parts of the organization. So it doesn't have to take long at all. In fact, it can just take a couple of weeks of preparation.
Considering your experience with the large-scale companies, would you say that looking at an enterprise level, so let's not talk about the small companies that, from a pure number point of view, obviously have an advantage in turning quicker, would be at least my assumption.
Right.
Whether it's right or wrong, I don't know.
Yeah.
But turning a tanker or a big kind of ship that is like Siemens or any kind of big enterprise
Right.
might be much more complicated. Is there any difference in the big tankers in terms of how they manage that transition?
There are. In less or large-scale Scrum, we recommend that the adoption only be done for a small product group of around 50 people. So we don't try to do a large enterprise change to less all at once, because it'll just drown the organization. If you try to do it really broad and at the same time, really deep at the same time, it'll just drown in too much change. So if we're talking about an organization that's large with large product groups or multiple product groups, we recommend one 50-person product group at a time. So we're flipping the system to simplifying the elimination of a lot of traditional roles just in that small scale. And if it's what we call a less huge case, where, for example, there's hundreds, 500 or 1,000 people on one product, then unless we do the change incrementally in the following way, there's two less frameworks. There's the smaller less framework, which is for around up to 50 people in one product group. And then there's the second larger called less huge framework. And in the less huge framework, which is up to 500 or 1,000 people in one product group, the product group is subdivided into what are called customer areas or requirement areas. And each customer area or requirement area is itself only 50 or 75 people. And in that second case, similarly, we only change the system for one requirement area at a time. So for example, if there's 500 people working in one product group, then we will incrementally only flip the system one requirement area at a time of, for example, 50 people, which means that it could take 4 or 5 years in that second context to complete the transformation of the large product group to a dramatically simpler model without much need for traditional managers.
Okay. I think that's also a very good way to go to the next question. Is there any reoccurring patterns in terms of obstacles, in terms of impediments that are kind of a...
Yeah. The pattern that I've seen repeatedly over the decades, I've kind of summarized into what are called Luhrmann's laws of organizational behavior. So this reflects my observation of the dominant impediments to doing real change. There's 4 laws. The first law is the following, that organizations are implicitly optimized to maintain the status quo for middle and first level managers and single specialists, and the power structures of middle managers and single specialists. So I've been working for 40 years, and I've seen a variety of change initiatives, from Scrum to Lean to total quality management and so forth. And in all of these change initiatives, all of them that actually in reality challenge the status quo of the traditional manager positions, this first law usually plays out, that the organizations are implicitly optimized to maintain the status quo for the traditional manager positions. And then that leads to the second law, which is that as a corollary of the first law, that the organizations are implicitly optimized for the status quo. It's a corollary. The second law is that the change initiative's new terminology will be redefined to mean the same as status quo. So, for example, you could take a new term like Lean or Scrum Master or Scrum or any new terminology or product owner, and essentially it will be mutated or redefined to essentially mean the same as the status quo. So project managers are now called product owners, or team leads are called scrum masters, and on and on. So in fact, it's largely just a facade so that you have the same organizational design, essentially the same, and then there's a patina of kind of scrum butt, for example, on top of it, where there's new labels put onto the existing traditional system. The third law is also, as a corollary of the first law, that the change initiative will be criticized as being theoretical, academic, purist, and needing pragmatic customization for local concerns. And what that means is that for any change initiative, whether it's Agile or Scrum or Lean, the single specialists and the managers will allow the hands-on frontline workers to play with the change up until the point that it actually bumps into the managers or the single specialists' status quo being challenged. And then the managers and the specialists will say that the change is not pragmatic. Because now it's actually challenging the status quo. And then they'll criticize the change initiative as being purist or theoretical. And so once again, the change initiative mutates or is forced to be mutated into essentially just the same old status quo with kind of a fake layer of changed labels on top. And the fourth Luhrmann's law is that culture follows structure. And what I mean by that is that you can't change culture, and you can't change mindset, and you can't change behavior. So if you ever hear somebody talk about, oh, we're going to change the culture, oh, Agile is a cultural change, this is a statement by a person who is, let's say, somewhat naive and has never really been involved in serious change, because culture follows structure. And what I mean by that is that you actually have to change the organizational design as a first order step for as a second order consequence for culture, behavior, mindset to actually change. For example, suppose that you were to say to people, please start becoming multi-skilled or multifunctional, learning a secondary or tertiary skill, and please start teaching that to other people. Suppose that in the organization, though, there are still traditional single-function job titles, such as requirements engineer or UI designer or programmer or tester. And suppose also there's the traditional career path that still exists, such as requirements engineer level 1 to 4 or tester level 1 to tester level 4, and so on and so forth. When that organizational design or structural element is in place, anything that you say about a behavior change, such as becoming multi-skilled or multifunctional, is not really going to happen, because the organizational design forces are first order, and any behavioral change is second order and is really a consequence of that first order. And so that's why actually you need to start with changing the organizational design, the structures, the roles, responsibilities, which is actually what Scrum does. But I think most people would say that if you look around the world, there's a vast amount of what some people call Scrum butt or fake Scrum. In fact, people have reported to me year after year that everywhere they go, all that they actually see is fake Scrum or fake Agile or fake XP or fake this change, fake that change. And why is that? It seems to me, boils down to this first law, once again, that the status quo of middle managers, first-line managers, and single specialists is being protected, so that any change initiative which challenges that is then mutated. I think that's the dominant dynamic that's going on.
Okay, I think that leads us to a very interesting next question. You said there is basically the stage is set, the target is clear, but looking at the current adoption rate of these ideas, they are not well on the overall scale. They are not equally distributed and not equally implemented in the same way.
Right.
Do you see any kind of areas that are upcoming things, as you just mentioned, organizational change. I think currently nobody is following really the idea, not from my perspective, in Germany, that culture follows organizational structure. So if you think about what is the main thing that should be addressed if you talk about that transformation, agile management in general. We talk about scaling.
Yes.
I think that addresses quite a few of these things, but it's a too big topic. I mean, is there any, if you would have a fairy tale capability, what would be the one or two next things that you really would pinpoint and say that is something that we need to address in the next years?
I think what needs to be addressed is a paradigm shift in traditional management. The whole idea of business administration and managers directing workers and single function jobs and so forth is largely an outdated idea. And the ideal future of management is really a dramatic reduction in traditional manager roles. It's not efficient, it's not effective, and it largely reflects a kind of an outdated 19th century or 18th century kind of military model of organizational design where you have a hierarchy and directing people and managers telling people what to do. That's where I think organizational design and management needs to go. But my prediction is, after seeing 40 years of management fads, that's not going to happen. My prediction is that Agile and Scrum and so forth will be, because of the dynamics that I've explained, primarily Luhrmann's first law, it'll be mutated to essentially remain as the status quo with just new labels on top. And then because the root causes and the fundamental system hasn't been changed, and the root cause problems of the system haven't been changed, then therefore I predict what's going to happen is that Agile and Scrum will just be viewed as another management fad in the endless cycle of management fads that I've seen over the decades. And because the root causes haven't been addressed, then in 5 or 10 or 15 years, the Agile and Scrum fad will also be considered as having failed. And then there will be some new fad, the chocolate foobar management fad, and that'll become popular in 5 or 10 years. And the chocolate foobar management fad will have new terminology and new colors and new role names and so forth, but it'll be exactly the same dynamic that the chocolate foobar fad, if it actually were to challenge the status quo of the traditional manager positions and the single specialists in 10 years, it too will have its terminology mutated. It too will be criticized as being purist or theoretical, and it will last for another 5 or 10 years, and people will make millions of dollars consulting in management foobar, and then in 15 years it too will have considered to have failed, and then we'll come up with the yellow foo-foo fad, and more people will make millions of dollars selling these fads.
But that sounds a little bit, depressing to me, actually, because basically what you're saying is it's a kind of an endless fight against the windmill, which we can't win, as we know from literature.
Yeah. Well, is it not? I mean, I've been working for 40 years, and this is what I've seen. I know you're relatively young, so maybe you have to be in business a bit longer to see the management fad cycle. But it seems to me what's going on, I'm neither being pessimistic or optimistic, rather I'm just observing what I think I see is happening. And I think until the underlying culture of the belief that the trajectory of people's career is ideally into overhead manager positions rather than hands-on doctors, scientists, engineers. As long as the paradigm remains the belief that the ideal career trajectory is in traditional overhead roles, directing other people and managing people, I think it'll just continue.
Okay. That could lead to the last question. Is there any idea you can provide what a conference like the Manage Agile conference can do that your prediction is not going to happen in terms of that we can support the process to come to a successful end? So what would be the direction that conference should go from your point of view to help the managers to support that idea?
Yeah, I think it would have to start with education of what the implications of the change in the organizational design really are. Most of the managers that I meet and work with, including those who come to Manage Agile-like conferences, seem to believe that what is being suggested is a new system for the workers, but they seem to believe that the existing manager positions remain intact. And I don't think that they've actually heard the real implications of Agile and Scrum, that because it's based upon self-managing teams and self-organizing, the traditional organization is dramatically simplified. And until they get the education to really understand that root understanding, nothing at the level of more superficial techniques or practices is really going to address what they need to understand. If they understood that, then the question becomes more interesting, and then traditional managers would have to start asking questions like, what different could I do? Could I become a hands-on scientist or engineer or doctor? Could I become a hands-on innovator? Could I focus on innovation? Could I focus on changing the organizational design instead of essentially maintaining the status quo? That would be the direction, I think, of the future of management as implied by Agile.